Okay, we're going to talk about the factors that trigger preterm labor, but first we'll review the normal progression of labor, because if you understand the normal progression, it's really easy to understand what factors influence preterm labor. So you are all familiar with the HPA axis that ends up secreting cortisol from your adrenal glands, but the cortisol has a negative feedback regulatory mechanism. And this is in the non-pregnant state, but when someone is pregnant, you have a placenta, and that placenta also secretes CRH. And the CRH secretion is stimulated by cortisol. So in the maternal and fetal HPA axes, cortisol does try to downregulate it through the same mechanism, but it upregulates CRH in the placenta. And so this is just a different picture of what that looks like. These two parallel positive feedback mechanisms. And you can see how after a while, like the CRH level is probably going to be elevated, right? The other thing to know is that it takes a while for the fetal HPA axis to develop. And initially, the placental CRH stimulates the adrenal glands, but the adrenal glands secrete androgens. And so you'll see that as DHEAS. And those androgens are then transformed into estrogen by the placenta. So, and then the estrogen goes into the maternal circulation and stimulates breast development, uterine blood flow. And so over time, the fetus will be able to secrete cortisol, but at the same time that it's being stimulated by CRH, the adrenal gland will both secrete cortisol and DHES. And so then that creates this other kind of positive feedback mechanism. And so the other positive feedback mechanism is going to be related to oxytocin. And so oxytocin is going to be secreted from the pituitary gland. It's going to stimulate the uterus to contract directly by binding to receptors on the uterus. It's also going to stimulate the placenta to make prostaglandins, and prostaglandins stimulate contractions. And then that has a positive feedback because the contractions actually stimulate the release of oxytocin from the pituitary. And so it's really that squeeze on or the force on the cervix that starts this positive feedback mechanism. But then you also have, the role of prostaglandins, and then to some degree estrogen. And so just another positive feedback mechanism. There are different hormones that dominate different stages of pregnancy and labor. So phase 0 is when the uterus is quiet and not contracting, and this is during pregnancy, during most of pregnancy, and progesterone is the major player here. Phase 1 is activation, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but that's as the uterus is becoming more able to have contractions that are regulated, and that is going to be driven largely by estrogen and to some degree prostaglandins. And then phase 2 is really the onset of labor to the delivery of the baby, and that is going to be driven by prostaglandins, oxytocin, and then involution is really going to be driven by oxytocin and thrombin, because oxytocin stimulates that contraction of smooth muscle. And so it's really a balance. In the beginning, when progesterone is the dominant hormone, it is inhibiting all of these different processes. And then it flips to estrogen, which stimulates all of these. So once there is a tipping point, once the hormonal secretion reaches a tipping point, then you go into labor. And so how do we reach that tipping point? Well, remember that cortisol that is released either from the mom or the fetus circulation stimulates the release of CRH. Sorry about that, I'll go back. That CRH stimulates the release of cortisol. So you have this building that probably gets bigger and bigger and bigger. CRH also positively stimulates prostaglandin secretion, which then positively stimulates CRH. CRH also stimulates estrogen secretion. And remember, because in the fetal circulation, the adrenal glands are stimulated to release the DHEAS, the androgens, which will be converted into estrogen. And then the estrogen also increases prostaglandin. So you just have this buildup. And then that's what really pushes someone to the tipping point once you reach that critical point where the ratio of progesterone and estrogen switch. So let's go through this in a little bit more detail. This is stage 0. This is when everything is being inhibited by progesterone. And so what are the ways that progesterone acts? First, it acts at the level of the muscle, the myometrium, the uterine muscle, and at the level of the cervix by decreasing inflammatory response and also decreasing the contractility. It also regulates the CRH release from the placenta. It also inhibits prostaglandins, and prostaglandins and other inflammatory cytokines are going to be responsible for the rupture of membranes, which is basically the water breaking. And then it's going to decrease prostaglandin production in the amniotic fluid too. So this is stage 0. Then as the fetal HPA axis develops, they are going to be releasing cortisol and androgens, and that is going to increase the estrogen, decrease the progesterone, and then also stimulate prostaglandins. And the way that estrogen works is by increasing the expression of uterine smooth muscle receptors. So during pregnancy, the level of oxytocin is relatively constant until labor. But the reason that it doesn't stimulate uterine contractions is because the uterus doesn't start off with a lot of oxytocin receptors. And so until the uterus is actually able to have enough oxytocin receptors, it's not going to be very responsive to oxytocin in the maternal circulation. And then stimulation, phase 2, this is going to be labor. So this is when we hit some critical point. At estrogen, we talked about increasing the oxytocin receptors in the wall of the uterus, but it also increases gap junctions between myometrial cells. And what this means is that even if our uterus has receptors to contract, whenever oxytocin binds to the receptors, we need the muscle to contract in coordinated ways. And so these gap junctions allow the uterus to contract as a coordinated unit. So like false labor, that's like a not coordinated, those are like practice contractions. And so estrogen helps with both of these. It also stimulates prostaglandin production, which also stimulates both of these. And then prostaglandins soften the uterus. So you need dilation, cervical dilation and thinning. And then once the baby is engaged, the uterus is able to contract, the baby is pressing on the cervix, then that's going to stimulate oxytocin secretion, which is going to increase uterine contractions, but also have this other method for positive feedback. And you see over here how this just kind of gets ridiculous, pretty quickly once you reach that critical point. Okay.